Welcome to WORLDwrite's London behind the scenes alternative tour of Brick Lane and the Whitechapel area. My name is Junaid and I'm your volunteer guide in the studio. You will meet more of our accredited guides during this online glimpse of our tour. On our tour we will consider how ideas about race have changed from the Enlightenment thinking of the 1700s, which for the first time considered all human beings as equal, the pessimism of the late 1800s, where attempts were made to apply Darwin's ideas and categorize people by race, to present-day ideas of cultural difference.
This beautiful black and golden sign that you see behind me is a sign for the Black Eagle Brewery. This was once the largest brewery in the UK. It was established outside the city walls because it was a smelly industry.
As it grew, the brewery drew on the local immigrant labour of the day. These were Huguenots who had fled religious persecution in France. Although most commonly recognised for their mastery in silk weaving, the Huguenots' legacy vis-à-vis the British brewery industry is worthy of note.
They were the ones who introduced new production techniques and new ingredients like fermented hops. And that was one of the reasons that the Black Eagle Brewery was so successful.
Mounted on the wall of the brewery is a blue plaque commemorating Sir Thomas Buxton, a parliamentarian, reformer, abolitionist.
He's actually commemorated on our £5 note as well.
His campaigns to abolish the slave trade, raise the wages of the Huguenot weavers, reform the prisons, mark him out as a key 19th century philanthropist. The 1800s onwards saw a growing class of industrialists concerned to hold on to their wealth and power, and an expanding working class living in desperate conditions. Early proponents of the free market, such as Adam Smith, had assumed that the growth in capital and industrialization would lead to wealth for everyone. But the reality of huge income inequalities were very evident. People in this area lived in terrible slum conditions, while the rich more usually lived in London's West End. In the 19th century, ideas on race began to provide an explanation on these huge disparities in wealth. It was believed that the working masses, the poor and immigrants, may be a lesser human species, a lower race. It is hardly surprising the British elite believed in their own racial superiority and national supremacy. As well as the lower orders, this also meant disdain for foreigners and those deemed members of lesser races in the colonies. They saw the colonies as a jungle over there, and the East End as a jungle over here. For the Quakers, this meant there were less able people in dire need of help and saving. In fact, such were the levels of poverty in this area, the place became a virtual magnet for missionaries. So much so that by the beginning of the 1900s, historians have suggested there were more missionaries in the East End than in India.
Mr. Buxton may have earned his blue plaque as a more humane man of his time, but this was definitely a period when backward ideas on race ruled. And on that note, let's move on to the next stop.
Number 19 started off as a home for French Huguenots who arrived in England in 1700s fleeing religious persecution in Catholic France. With the decline of the British silk weaving industry as the Industrial Revolution gathered pace, the Huguenots moved on and out, and Irish immigrants escaping the potato famine that had swept Ireland in the mid-19th century moved in. The Irish provided industrialists with a huge supply of cheap labour here in East London. The majority worked in the nearby docks and manufactories. Between 1870 and 1914, thousands of Jewish settlers arrived from Eastern Europe, fleeing appalling conditions, growing anti-Semitism and Tsarist pogroms in Russia. By the 1930s, the Jewish community was well established here in East London, many working in cabinet making, the fur trade and tailoring. Houses like this one, where Huguenots once wove silk, now became workplace and home for Jewish families. Life was hard for new arrivals, and the Jewish community tried to help each other out. One Jewish self-help group called the Loyal United Friends leased rooms here at number 19, which they converted into a synagogue, and created a meeting place in the basement where campaigners fighting anti-Semitism could gather. During this period, Britain was beginning to experience its first challenge to economic dominance. A period of growing economic depression gave rise to massive cuts in workers' living standards, and rising unemployment pushed thousands into abject poverty. Hardship contributed to an explosion of new unionism, and a strike wave that swept Britain in 1889 involved thousands of women and immigrant workers.
Join our hands in union strong to battle or to die.
The Dockers' strike, the first casual workers' strike, and the Matchstick Girls' strike are two famous examples. It was in the growing industrial cities where employers and politicians began blaming immigrants for keeping wages low.
These divide and rule tactics culminated in the first law to control immigration, the 1905 Aliens Act. Set up high in the wall above me, you will see a vertical sundial with the Latin inscription Umbra Summus. This means we are shadows, and although it refers to the workings of the sundial, I think it has added meaning when you think of the immigrants who have come and gone in this area.
Tighter immigration legislation introduced in the 60s and 70s gave legitimacy to the idea that newly settled Bangladeshis in Spitalfields did not belong here. As officially sanctioned second-class citizens, immigrants became an easy target for attack and could be blamed for everything. The ideas of too many workers chasing too few jobs became popular, and demands to protect British jobs for British workers, a common slogan. These ideas spurred violent racist attacks on the ground. In 1978, very real blood was spilled near this park. On the 4th of May 1978, on the eve of local elections and a year before Margaret Thatcher came to power, a local textile worker by the name of Altab Ali was murdered in a racist attack and left in a pool of blood in Whitechapel Road. He worked in Hanbury Street off Brick Lane and was heading home past the park to Cannon Street Road when he was attacked by a group of racists. After Altab Ali's murder, his coffin was carried to Whitehall in a long procession led by thousands of Asian youth and anti-racists, highlighting the anger many felt at the government's failure to do anything about racist attacks, at levels of police racism and the criminalisation by the government of immigrant communities. This mass mobilisation of local anti-racists put paid to further large-scale racist incursions in Brick Lane. Fears of riots in the 1980s finally transformed the divisive racist politics of the preceding era into a radical new form, as we should learn about at the end of our tour.